All right.
I'm good. How are you?
Yes,
I'm good.
how are
We
you?
have this wonderful panel. Let me explain what we're doing. So basically, the background to this is that this conference, the Environment Camp, sort of came out of something called the program. And it's worth just sort of mentioning that because that started in 2020. But I don't know, a few PhD students, and there's now like 25 PhD students in economics, geography, environment, and so forth. So there's both the growth in PhD student interest that's important, but not also an important innovation of that group, this is PhD group, was that we decided to ask faculty only to talk about what they thought would be interesting for PhD students to work on, rather than about their great papers. And that turned out to be a good innovation because one of the early invitees was Per, who kind of blew all the students away with how interesting macro is for climate and environment, which is why we've invited him back. So the idea of the panel today is simple. We're going to have people talk for about 5 minutes about what they think of what is the future of environmental economics research. And I think it's worth mentioning that there's different sort of flavors here, which is important. So what we're going to do is we're going to have John go first. And John is interesting because, and all the panelists are interesting because I'm not sure they all, I don't know which ones identify as environmental economists, but they're all kind of crowding into the environment space. And that's sort of the idea of the EE group. So John has kind of worked a lot on innovation, on productivity. And so I think that's going to be talking to a lot of the bits of what was in the Per lecture and green energy and the spread of innovation in that space. So I think we'll start there, and then I think we'll go to Camille. And Camille is coming from a very different perspective in the sense that he's now the boss of the Council of Economic Advisors, chair or something in France. So he is both a distinguished public economist, John is a distinguished IO economist. And so Camille's coming in more from the side of policy, like where is research needed for the green transition, I presume, in France and possibly in the EU as well. So I think it's worth kind of throwing in the policy demands there. And then finally, we'll have, before Per finishes at the end, Esther. Me and Esther kind of grew up doing development economics. And I guess gradually we've shaded into environmental stuff. And it goes directly to the thing that Per brought up, which is the heterogeneity effect. That it may well be that, you know, when you look at, say, Bangladesh, some parts are not that effective, but when you look at some parts of Bangladesh, they're hyper effective. And so how does one deal with those damages? As to be talking this evening about, you know, the international gathering of money, payment to deal with the damages. So the nice thing about and then if you don't mind, Per, you come at the end and sort of wrap up a bit of say what you think. So I think what's nice is that we're kind of drawing in different fields, macro, IO, public, development, all of which are represented in the EE group. And I think that's sort of how we see things progressing is you get more and more stuff from different fields of economics and sort of apply them to the big environmental issues of our time. So I think Camille put it in one of our meetings and we all have to be environmental economists now. So let's begin with John. And John, you can come up here if you prefer, or just speak from there.
I'll speak from here. Okay, so I'm so used to going last because of my V in my, you know, I'm always the et al. So I was surprised that I'm going first. I'm very honoured, Robert. Thank you very much. So there's this quote which it goes something like, you know, do not ask me to write the music of the future because if I could write the music of the future, I would have already written it. And I always think that a bit applies to research. I mean, if you're asking me to write, what should you research on? I would have already written, I would try to write that research myself. Now, that quote, you know, I always attribute that to Marx. And of course, you know, that may have been a bit of a mistake in retrospect if you think about the implementation of Marxism in some economies around the world. Actually trying to, you know, make some better implementation may have been better. But let me have a go. So, you know, I'm obviously obsessed with technology and innovation. So I do think that one of the areas that environmental economics should focus on is thinking about the role of technical change and autonomous technical change. And I kind of see that in three different areas of environmental economics. So one is, and I guess this is where some of the literature is focused, which is kind of innovation, the frontier. So often we traditionally focus on the speed of technological progress at the frontier, but of course, increasingly, lots of people are thinking about directed technological change. So, my former colleague and Esther's colleague Daron is very focused on that. So if you think about green technology, that should be a real focus. So innovation at the frontier. Secondly, diffusion of existing innovations. So how we actually get the adoption of new technologies by firms and households in the green space, I think is important to think about the policies and incentives around that. Per touched on that. And the third thing is more controversially, if you wanted to think of things around Plan B, geoengineering type of solutions and the economics of that, I think that's also worth thinking about as well. So let me talk about the first one first. So in terms of thinking about directed technical change at the frontier, one set of policies is the same policies that Per was talking about, the kind of carbon pricing. And that has a double advantage in the sense that both you, well, triple advantage, you actually change people's consumption behavior, you also change their incentives to adopt new technologies, and because you're effectively, if it's a credible carbon tax, creating a new market, a bigger demand for green technologies, you incentivize R&D to be directed towards that technology. So I think that's an obvious type of a policy. The kind of work that Philippe Aguillon and I started doing in the automobile industry was exactly in this type of area. How do fuel-adjusted carbon prices affect the way that you go towards electric vehicles, for example, rather than internal combustion engine type of vehicles? The problem, I think, with that, or one of the issues, I mean, I love carbon tax. I think that's fantastic. There's two problems. One is the issue, and we saw this in some of our work, that there's a big path dependency. So if there's a lot of dirty technologies which have been there in the past, the natural course of events is to build on the same shoulders of giants and continue doing that in the future. So where path dependency is important is, we need a lot more work looking at the degree of that lock-in and path dependency. A carbon tax will be less effective because it's harder to shift the kind of super tanker of technological progress in a different direction. So that's one issue, and thinking about how difficult that is, how big that is important. The second problem is that it's a political economy problem essentially. So we've groped towards a better effective carbon tax in the European Union through the European trading system, but in the rest of the world, the United States, we're nowhere near that. So because of that constraint, I think we have to think about alternative sets of policies and evaluating and looking at those alternative policies. So I do think that trying to look more closely at policies which are subsidizing research and development, especially around green technology. There's a few papers on that, like Sabrina Howell's, but not very much. They're really important innovation policies. A second set of policies, bit more like the IRA, which are kind of policies which are around production subsidies or adoption subsidies. Those may have knock-on effects through things like learning by doing and experience effects, which people believe are very important in think about something's called rights law, the relationship between the kind of cumulative production of a technology and the fall of its cost. I think the technologists use this all the time. Economists have had relatively little to say in that area of how these types of policies, these are kind of green industrial policies, actually affect the speed at which costs might change and the speed at which prices might fall. So, Robin and I are working a bit with Pol and others, looking at this in terms of Chinese industrial policy. There's lots of these type of policies around the world that we could actually do a lot more on looking at and trying to estimate, and this is hopefully eventually form macro models. And then finally on diffusion, again, this is an area I think that there is more work happening on this, why people adopt, why they don't adopt, to what extent are these kind of rational decisions in the face of imperfect information. that brings in issues of, social effects on diffusion, network effects, behavioral type of aspects of why people adopt or don't adopt. So I think that also opens up a very rich area, lots of interesting work which can be done in terms of thinking about real experiments or quasi experiments, looking at incentives for adoption. So that's, I think, another really exciting area to work in. And then hopefully bringing all these type of estimates from the kind of more applied micro side into the kind of models that Per was talking about in the previous lecture. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So Camille.
Great. Okay. So as Robin mentioned, I'm going to take my hat of chairman of the French Council of Economic Advisors and try to give you a little bit more insights into what I believe are important areas in which your research can contribute to policy. The first thing that I wanted to mention, and that's super important, I think, for you, is that this is definitely the area where research has potentially the maximum level of impact. I believe that climate change and green transition are really the big challenges of our time. And as I'm going to try to tell you, we have such an immense lack of knowledge about what to do that everything that you can do is going to have a lot of impact. And I think what's super important as well is to realize that this is one of the few areas in economics where there's not going to be any trade-off for you between the policy impact that you can achieve and the academic returns. It's a bit like, again, development economics 25 years ago. There is a huge demand in the public debate, in policy circles for this type of research. And I think there is a growing sense of demand as well in academia for this. So you can't go wrong in choosing essentially environmental economics at this stage. So now what is it that I see as the big holes in what we are able to contribute at this stage? And again, I think this is also partly due to our lack of ability to work on these issues sufficiently ahead of time. We're really lagging behind in terms of what we can contribute to the debate. But the good news is I believe in you as the next generation to solve this. So I see 4 areas where we're really lacking the most basic evidence that could guide policies. The first is data and measurement. The second one is modeling. The third one is evaluation. And the fourth one are essentially distribution impact and social acceptability. So let me try to be a little bit more specific about each of these in turn. So first, data and measurement. When I started at the French Council, I was flabbergasted, really, to see the extremely poor state of the public data infrastructure when it comes to the green transition. It's really mind-boggling to see how little we know. And I think, of course, there are reasons for this, which is that we are dealing with a lot of totally new policy tools. And of course, statistics, they come because, at some point, the government believes that it needs to do something and gathers data in order to guide its action. After all, statistics come in etymological term from the data that serves the purpose of the action of the state. So it's no wonder that, if we haven't dealt with these tools before, of course, we never brought together the enforcement and the administrative setup to gather the data that we need. So that's one. But what that means is that when it comes to the most basic things, such as, estimating damages, measuring the externalities that are created by fossil fuels and stuff like that, but also measuring the type of behaviors that we need to change, or again, looking at distributional impact, we are in a very dire situation. Now, one really important thing, and why I think research, and especially you guys, are in an ideal position to help solve that problem, is that we're also facing an issue with the fact that a lot of these data, therefore, because it's not produced by the state, it's often proprietary, okay? And it's proprietary data that is essentially in the hands of people who might have little incentives to share it with the government. And this is where basically, usually, research has been at the forefront, because it's less problematic to share data with scientists than it is to share it with the government. And oftentimes as well, you have the creativity to make that data useful for policymakers. Okay, so the type of examples I have in mind is everything that has to do with using satellites, high resolution images, and trying to, from this, build models that can essentially have precise measurement of the externalities created by wildfires or deforestation, that type of stuff. Clearly here, research has been at the forefront of creating this new data infrastructure that is then used by government in order to guide policies. But there are many other examples that we could mention, and I think that's really key. One thing that is also extremely important in that regard is that I think it's extremely important for you when you gather this new data to also think about making the additional effort to go not just from, estimating what you need in your little context, but trying to think about, how can I use this in order to build a total infrastructure that eventually leads to, this being able to be used by national accounting, for instance. Again, right now, we are having a big lag in our ability for our national accounting systems to account for environmental externalities, precisely because there is this feeling that we lack the robustness in this type of measures. But I think we can go that extra mile. It's just a question of doing that effort, and I think it's important that we do that together, okay? So then models. I couldn't agree more with what Per said in his lecture. We really need models, first because it's a global issue. Every policies that we're going to need to put in place, we're going to need to put them at scale. So it's not that we're dealing with small policies that we can analyze in partial equilibrium. Everything we need to do is going to be in the realm of general equilibrium, and we're going to need models that account for all these complex interactions. The second thing about models, and why we really need them in the context of the policies for the green transition, is that we're fundamentally in the second best world, okay? And in the second best world, all the interactions between all the inefficiencies that we're creating when we're adjusting our policy tools one way or the other are really going to matter, and that's important that we deal with them. And the last thing is that, again, we're dealing with new instruments. Most of the things that we need to put in place, we've never put in place before. That means that we cannot just resort to ex post evaluation. In a lot of contexts, we're going to need ex ante evaluation. And with ex ante evaluation, we need models to just give us a sense of, what's first order, what's second order. And that's really important. I'll take a very simple example that shows you that the type of modeling that we need is not just this kind of grand macro modeling. Sometimes we need very good models that are going to account for a whole sector. I was, again, extremely surprised to see that we're putting in place a lot of new policies when it comes to electric vehicles, but we don't have actually a good model of the global supply of electric vehicles, and we don't have a good model of demand for vehicles that would account for the new vehicles, but also the secondary market and also the experts of the used vehicles that we do. And that's key to have all of this taken together, because we're going to put in place demand instruments to shock the demand for new electric vehicles. So we need to know how supply is going to respond. Are those cars going to come from China, or are they going to come from Europe that we care about? And also we care about the full demand, because again, there's going to be massive leakage if we don't account for the fact that, the new electric vehicles, they're going to come, at the expense of some used cars that are going to go in the market, and who is going to drive those cars is going to matter immensely for the type of carbon emissions that we're going to generate. So here we really need to make an effort. So we're doing stuff at the French Council to deal with this, but yeah, that's the type of modeling exercises that we need. So I'll be quick, sorry. So then on the last 2 points, evaluation. Yeah, of course, we're going to need evaluation, but we're going to need quick evaluation. We need to put in place massive policies in the next 10 years. We have very, very little time to optimize all these instruments that most of them, we've mentioned, are second best instruments. So it's going to be quite complicated, and we have very little time. So we need a lot of quick evaluation. So what's going to be key is, of course, to think about ways to do quick evaluation. So any research that you can do on evaluating all those new policies that are put in place are important, but also thinking about ways to aggregate existing evidence. So meta-analysis and how we deal with inference in a context where we have very few data points about, policy experimentation happening in different contexts. That's going to be key as well. And then what I think is really important as well is to realize that for all these kind of policy evaluation, we're going to need a good conceptual framework to make all these evaluation comparable. In some sense, we will need to be able to get an abatement cost out of each policy. So we really need to think about, the conceptual framework really carefully in order to get that number out of all the policy evaluation that we're conducting. The last thing, but I'll be extremely brief, is that, again, it's massive effort that we need to do, a whole of new policy tools. If we don't think about distributional impact and social acceptability, we are going to have a problem. And therefore, everything that you can do as well on this dimension, this is research that is immensely valuable to policymakers.
Fantastic, thanks, Camille. Esther, do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective, and then we'll start talking between us after for.
I don't know if you noticed that as Camille said, he needs the evaluation to be fast. He started speaking very, very, very fast. The sign of the hurry in which this whole thing is. Okay. I feel a bit as an interloper because I'm kind of a Johnny come lately as far as working on this topic, although working on the climate topic, but not on the environment topic that I started a long time ago. So let me go back to the title of the panel, The Future of Environmental Economics Research, to say that as far as developing countries are concerned anyways, it's not just working on climate. Today, pollution kills many more people than hot temperature, although hot temperature are pretty bad and they will become worse. But so, and the two problems are of course related. So because the kind of immediate impact of the co-pollutant, for example, air pollution, related to the use of fossil fuel, in particular coal, are today immediately enormous, order of magnitudes larger in terms of for some countries, for example, in India, Pakistan, etc. And it is related because maybe you can use, maybe it's actually not the case now, but it could be at some point there is more demand to address this issue immediately than the climate issue that is seen to be in the longer run. And of course, there could be solution that helps dealing with the two problems at the same time. So I think the future of environmental economics research shouldn't leave aside pollution. The other thing is still for developing countries is that, so until very recently in the policy world, there was no interest at all for adaptation to climate change. And then suddenly policymakers have seen the lights, and as of 47 minutes ago, it's adaptation. Although there is no money for it, but at least there is a speech for it. It's a good thing. It's a good thing when the rhetoric change, sometimes action change. But when you ask people what they have in mind when they're thinking of adaptation to climate change, they will talk about a cooling center for all people when it's hot, which is great. But and then that's kind of it. Maybe levies come to. So this really reflects the fact that our research on adaptation to climate change is very limited, reflecting the fact that there is not so much research generally on various aspects of climate change and not very much on adaptation. And of course, whatever we do now, even if we do the tax, it's some stock of carbon is already there, someone is already going to happen. The impact are disproportionately going to be in poor countries. And so regardless of what happens on any other front, thinking more seriously about adaptation and having more than cooling center to offer will be very interesting. And one of the questions, of course, as economists is, why it's a question for us, and what are, do we think that people should do it by themselves? If they, what is it, what are the any number of market failures that explain why it will be difficult at the individual level to adapt to warmer temperature. What's the difference between adaptation in the sense of reacting to the fact that it's hot today versus ex ante thinking, oh, now it's durably going to be warmer, so should I move? Should I change my cropping pattern and so on? And that's of course, much harder to do because it hasn't happened yet. So there are few instances of permanent change in climate, but so it's kind of very open. And there is not that much research. There is some, but not that much in development economics, especially, and it's not very organized. So I think that would be an interesting area in the climate per se, in the climate world per se. Adaptation is kind of not a nuisance, but it's something you need to take into account to say that the impacts are going to be lower than they would be without. But it's not like so much. It's not has been so much an object of interest. It's been in development, but without a little bit in abstraction of what the world of climate has been. So I think there is an interesting thing very interesting set of issues, very important set of issues, and manageable for the microeconomic involved people, inclined people. This is more sort of traditional kind of problems that for micro inclined people that would be very relevant. The last point I want to highlight is that, which has not been mentioned yet, which is what I'm highlighting it now, is there is a lot of, is the potential for behavior change. So nothing against technology, but the world of climate is, in my opinion, often a little over-optimistic about what technology can do and a little pessimistic about how behavior can change. And you just have to compare Europe and the US, just the carbon footprint of individuals, to know that the behavior makes a big difference. Of course, the US is a very different country. It's much bigger, vast difference in temperature. So maybe their fundamental energy needs are larger, but without having calculated it, I have a sense that it's not just that. So people have learned to, it's not the fact that our need for energy is very ingrained as a strong preferences that we have to take as given. And that seems to be itself potentially the object of study. A little bit like adaptation has to be done, why some of the things are individual, some of the things, the response to infrastructure. So some will be more micro, some will be more macro. That's actually research that can be done in rich countries and also in poor countries, because to some extent, of course, there is vast energy needs in poor countries that are very difficult to deny, especially as it gets hot, and people will need energy to deal with the hot temperature. But there are other ways in which you can imagine that that behavior would be highly relevant, and behavior leads you to policy and so on. And then the third one that's maybe related to the political acceptability. So that's more of a sort of political economy point, both within and across countries. The perception of what is fair and what is not fair, and therefore what is acceptable and what is not acceptable is really important. So and cannot be. It has, in the same way that we have to model things even if we don't like it. We have to take political economy account even if we don't like it, because that's going to come in a way. So we know it, for example, for carbon tax. It's clear that it's something that has a distributional impact that in our world we can fix, but in the true world it's harder to fix, and there is no trust that it can be fixed and so on. So many efforts have been scuttled, and others have not been scuttled. So kind of understanding that is important. And then across country, Per just convinced us that we need a uniform price of carbon. The EU is trying to do it single-handedly by doing carbon price adjustment. It is it doesn't please very many people who are trying to, sort of Brazil or Kenya or whatever, who wants to import their stuff to us. They will see that, they don't see that as climate change, they see that as protectionism. And how we having, what are the distributional impact of uniform carbon pricing, how we construct it, how we construct it in a way that the distributional impact are fixed and in a way that is done in a robust way. You know, it's like this kind of equivalent of this mechanism design that are not only strategy proof, but are strategy proof in a way that is obvious to people. Like similarly, I think that we have to really start thinking about not just, well, in principle, I could fix the distributional problem, but in practice, what are the type of mechanisms that are going to inspire confidence inside and within and across countries? And what are the limits that this poses onto what can be done, whether we need to move from third best to fifth best, because that's the only thing we can possibly do, and so on and so forth. And I would say that I agree with Camille. There is a imbalance between supply and demand of environmental economists at the moment, which is very much in the favor of the supply side. So in a very tight labor market and a very difficult labor market for graduate students this year, we had more job in environment that we could supply students for. So that's gonna last for a little while. So it's always dangerous to follow fashion, but I think that's if you start being like about to be in your third, fourth year of PhD, probably good still for you. So it's not a very risky gamble.
But you are doing it for the planet, remember.
Not just your wages.
But you know, a job and so on.
Wages are the same, right, regardless of field.
Sorry? Yeah, but the probability of a job is not.
Expected remuneration.
Okay, Per, do you want to kind of respond a little bit and then we can talk a bit more?
I respond.
Yeah, just, I mean, however you want.
Compliment.
Yeah. I was expecting you to ask me for my vision,
Yes.
but my answer was going to be, I don't think I'm not good at, I don't do visions because that's not, I don't know, I find this area fascinating. It's important. I know when I started working on it, I had a certain view what was good, what it was going to be. I've changed my views several times, kept going, and I think for me it's more about being interested in something and I don't know, trying to understand it as well as possible. And I think it's a good field to work on. I mean, when I started I thought that this non-linearity tipping points was a big deal, but I slowly realized that if I wanted to stand on some facts on that, it was very difficult. So even if you like it, you know, so I think policy relevance is just becoming more and more important. And I think I don't want to disagree with anything, just like some things resonate particularly with me. And so my colleague, John Hassler, who's been doing all this work with me, he's like Mr. Climate today in Sweden. It's enormous impact, kind of single-handedly changed the government's climate plan. And I think it's all good. And doing research on this while having influence on policy is really a great thing. And I think in the US, for the long time I was there, I mean, it may be a little bit different for you, but for me, you were quite far from policymaking. In small countries like my country, you know, they ask you all the time if you're interested in helping out. And so and when you do, you realize about the problems that policymakers are facing. They don't know ABCD, and you realize then where the gaps are. And, you know, Camille helped put the finger on some gaps that are really there. I think one thing that I didn't talk about today that I think is important also is what you touched on, the political acceptability. But even if you don't think you're like very deep on, you know, understand politics very deeply, you can still look at distributional impacts. And when I started this work, I worked on macro and inequality for many years. And this is not the area where you work on that, but now I've come to change completely. I think, why is it relevant? Because the acceptability of any plans to deal with the carbon problem will have to look very carefully at who's affected in what way. I mean, behaviors, I mean, I think that first order thing is that people do respond to economic incentives. So when they're hurt for economic reasons, they really protest. And we need to understand that a little bit in advance, because we understand it too late, as in France with these yellow vests. And it's really a warning sign. So I think that there's just an enormous amount of work to do there. And it's also very, like applied micro, you need to understand by country who's affected in what way. Unfortunately, I don't think there's like a simple recipe that fixes everything. But not thinking about this is a major mistake. To comment on one thing, John, just to get a little bit of a debate going. I mean, I do have this feeling that there's a lot of people out there who just like technology, and when it comes to this last thing that I showed, that, well, I don't know how substitutable things are. There's a lot of people out there who want to show that it's substitutable. They just want that to be the answer. And it worries me a little bit. It may be the answer. I just don't know. So on the one hand, I want to say, yeah, it's very important to do the research on it, but, be prepared that maybe there's a problem there and that maybe it's not as easy as many people seem to think. So I mean, I just can't say enough how important I think that is. And
No,
I just
agree.
like, there was a time when everybody was trying to show that damages were so high. I don't think we need that anymore. The damages are high. They are very bad, especially in many poor parts of the world. It's more about action. How do we get it going? And so it's a little bit here. I'm not sure. Maybe you'll find that this slow-moving thing, and that you have to use green subsidy, maybe, but without like hitting carbon head-on, I'm just super worried. And then it's like anything you do indirectly, to the extent that it is taxing carbon, because that's what it has to do. And that is good, but why not do it straight?
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that, like I said, my instinct is having a very strong carbon tax is probably the first best. I mean, you can argue about that because you can give them the path dependency.
It's an anchor.
But the reality is, as Esther said, look at the US. There's absolutely no chance of that happening, really, realistically. So then you have to say, what's the second or third or fourth best response to that? In my view, is you need to use a range of policy tools in the real world. I mean, yes, where you can do it, the carbon tax, think about some regulation, but also think seriously about these, there are a wider range of kind of green kind of technology policies, industrial policies. We don't really understand, as economists, we have this gut reaction, terrible, touched in with the barge pole. But governments are doing this all over the world. And I think it's our duty almost to actually shed light on the efficacy, where that works, where that doesn't work, how we can help guide governments.
I agree.
And make recommendations to think about how those happen. Because otherwise, government's going to do this with, in a vacuum of evidence. We shouldn't be naive about it. I mean, governments do things often regardless of our advice, but the extent to which we can actually put evidence on the table and help guide some of that, like John Hassler did, I think is a very good thing.
But do you think like this, what's it called, the carbon border adjustment
Yes.
thing? I mean, for both of you, like, is that going to be a substitute? Like if the US did a carbon.
So I wanted to bring that up in response to both of you, because Esther brought that up. So to defend those of you who don't know it, there's actually, now it's kind of been introduced, or the first stage of it, which is in Europe, which is, effectively taxing the carbon content of goods coming into Europe. And one of the reasons for that is that, one of the problems with the European approach, the European trading, the ECS approach, is that, yes, Europe reduces its production of carbon, but if we're just consuming carbon because it's all being produced in China, we're importing it, it doesn't do anything for the world, makes us feel good about ourselves as Europeans. But, you know, is not effective. You know, what you want to do is actually reduce everybody's consumption of carbon. So the CBAM is an attempt to try and do that. It has two advantages. One advantage is that it actually, you know, may placate some of the political economy issues. The Europeans are saying, well, you know, this is all going to China and we're losing all our jobs in industry. It helps the political economy. It also maybe gives incentives to other countries to actually change their policies as well. Now, the downside, of course, is that for many developing countries, this is going to hurt developing countries. That's why they're arguing against it. So you have to take that into account, try to think of compensation mechanisms to deal with that. But the CBAM does have to. Now, there's a big role for actually economists and you guys thinking about how you could do it better. So the way the CBAM is doing is not really the most efficient way. There's lots of room for improvements. But I do think it's an example of a policy innovation which is informed by economics, which may have some real benefits.
Robin, can I just add something that I actually wrote down, but I forgot to say? I said during my talk, and I tend to say that Europe's system is very good. I mean, we've added this piece now, but the essential thing is the plan for emissions in Europe is just remarkable that it's going to zero so fast. Initially, it was going to zero, but kind of slowly. Yeah. We're including like everything in it. Methane is not, so we need to work on methane, but carbon dioxide, basically everything is in this regulation. There is a quantity. So if we actually deliver, it's going to be very expensive to emit carbon. I don't think people have realized yet. So, you know, the reactions all around will be, can be brutal, and we need to prepare for that. And this is like within 10 years, 20 years, the price of emission rights, I can't see anything but like skyrocketing. Unfortunately, one way out is just people just get upset and leave the EU, or, you know, that's right now, no, but so I think that's why all this, I don't think we've seen even the beginning of the.
It doesn't the stuff that John was talking about, like things that do the same thing like a car, but don't, you know, then you're not facing the higher, you know, it becomes cheaper, right? Because you know the heating or whatever is low carbon. So because if you go to the price where you don't have innovation, it may become politically infeasible, right? But people just say no, we're not supporting this anymore. Even within the EU could change direction.
That's what I'm saying, that we need to be prepared for that.
It seems like innovation within a lot of stuff is going to be or you know, people heating their houses less, or using cars less, or traveling less.
Innovation is a very important complement, for sure. Otherwise, it's going to be even harder. But I'm just saying it's going to be hard anyway.
Yeah. Good. I had one question for Esther, actually, which kind of pushing on the adaptation side a bit, which is, do you think that a lot of the solution is simply going to be anti-poverty? I mean, we focused on poverty for a long time, and then it kind of there was a separate climate thing, environment thing, and now it looks like there's been a lot of relabeling of many programs. Do you think that's going to be a big part of adaptation, simply getting growth to move up if you look at Michael's stuff, you know, if you become sort of even lower middle income, you're in a way better place in terms of the mortality effects. So what do you think of that idea that growth, which a lot of these people have worked on, is actually going to be a key part of protecting people in these, you know, high damage places?
Well, first of all, one thing that concerns me is that from the lens of a development economist, these people are very poor today, and they are dying of all sorts of stuff that is not climate, and have a very terrible life even today. And one of the problem of the world seeing the light on climate is suddenly there is a shift, relabeling of things, but also actual shift of resources away from the, you know, bread and butter of poverty to other things. And in particular, Maybe the problem with counting on growth to help the poor countries adapt to climate change is that that creates emission, which we don't like. So as a development economist, I'm a bit of two minds in rich countries currently discovering that this is coming for them also, and getting this as a, putting this a little bit. I think the recent love for adaptation, the 5 cents that they managed to put in the loss and damage fund is actually a relabeling of things that existed before. So it's essentially no new money for this purpose. So yes, I think we need to continue being concerned about the bread and butter of development. And that you have that work from the ultra poor showing that people who are extraordinarily poor are not very well equipped to deal with any shock. They are not insured. There's not much credit, formal or informal. And of course, when you're poor, your marginal utility of consumption is very, very, very high. So not just climate, but just the standard weather shocks are harder to absorb for people who are very poor. We have known that for a long time. And if people become a bit less poor, they'll be in better position to do that. So I think more than growth, if we're really focusing on the mortality piece, more than growth, it's really social protection, which is, so ultra poor, and also a better ability to deal with shocks. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and talk about today, is that if we had a lot of money available to help protect people really on this mortality piece, a lot of it could be productively spent on kind of fairly standard social protection programs, like which you could give a climate or a weather flavor by saying, for example, by making them, for example, contingent on bad weather realization. We do know that money is very protective. We also know that people make good use of it, and we know that it's very convenient to administer. So I think one can go a long way with that. Another thing we learned during COVID is that the sort of whatever it takes kind of approach, it doesn't work if you cannot borrow on the world market. Mm-hmm. So the poor countries were only able to spend about 2% of their GDP on fiscal stimulus measure for their citizens during COVID. And likewise, because the insurance market work very poorly when they get when there is a huge shock. It doesn't have to be a climate shock. It could be COVID, it can be an earthquake, it can be a climate shock. They are the insurer. The government is the insurer of last resort, but they themselves are not reinsured. So that causes a lot of, this actually, research is good, but actually on this, I think we a lot of the evidence already around that we kind of know what to do. I don't know if you would call it adaptation, because it's really ex post coping with the situation, but it would prevent a lot of damage. And then down the line, yes, of course, I think poor countries need to grow. Yes. And that's going to cause emissions. So we also have to take that into consideration. For example, to some extent, it's possible to avoid sending them in the direction we want to. Maybe this is where more research is needed on the sustainability, right? Places that don't have coal places today, it seems a bit ridiculous that they would go and build one, but this is what India is doing. So how do we it's easier to, given the sunk investment, like once an investment is there, you have to pile up on it. Maybe there are interesting research of how one could take the right path. It seems cheaper before you get into the path than after. I don't think it's particularly original what I'm saying, but it's also worth thinking.
So we have just like 5 more minutes. So could we, what I thought maybe just to finish with going this direction, just ideas on how one feeds research or does research with. So I feel like in the environment climate space, I mean, I've tried to engage a bit with COP. It's very difficult. The World Bank is sort of half involved as far as I can tell, IMF. So just some views on how would we feed research into policy? Is that going to have to go country by country? Are we going to use international organizations? Are we use NGOs? Just any quick views you have on that, because that was a very powerful thing in really in development. You know, there are certain groups you work with. This is obviously a global problem. It doesn't look like there's institutions that have been designed to deal with or well designed to deal with climate change yet. So just to finish, maybe just a couple of minutes each, starting with Camille and then just going down the line.
Everything. No, but I mean, yeah, we need to be everywhere to speak loudly in every forum that we can get access to. That's what we need to do. I would say that again, academia has a very interesting place and therefore role to play, which is that we're already very international. It's a way where we exchange ideas, but we can exchange also, like, you know, results on experimentation that we're doing across very different places. So in that respect, I think you'd be surprised how little policymakers in their own country know about what policies are being implemented elsewhere. So I think we really have a role to play. And the last thing I think we need to do as well is restore hope. And on that, I would want to come back a little bit to the discussion that Per and John were having, which is, I think we can show that it's doable. And I think once we actually do the work and do the math, what really surprises me is like, yeah, it's a massive effort, but I slightly disagree with Per. I mean, I never disagree with Per, but I think what's important is to realize that when you do the math, yes, it's very steep, the effort that we need to do, but it's nothing kind of impossible. Again, so in France, we've made the effort to try to quantify what that represented, and both in terms of overall strategy across sectors and in terms of what that means in terms of overall investment. It's not crazy. Basically, we need just to ramp up by roughly 1% of GDP every year from now for the next 20 years investment. But then, you know, at the end of the day, it's not crazy. It's about, okay, getting your electricity supply right and decarbonized. And then the most difficult part is about essentially transportation and housing. But there again, it's mostly about investment. I mean, with extremely basic assumption and very conservative assumptions with respect to how quickly we're going to go down the abatement cost curves, we found that, yeah, again, it's totally doable with roughly the existing technologies, and it's about just like, you know, doing the necessary investment, and the investment that we need is not crazy. It's a lot, okay, but it's not totally crazy. So I think it's our role to, you know, restore hope and show that it's doable and that we're gonna make it.
Brilliant, John.
So I think, I mean, this echoes a couple of the points, especially the one Camille was making earlier. I mean, there's a huge desire by policymakers to get information and advice from people like you. I mean, you might think you don't know very much. You know, compared to a typical person within the government, economists have an enormous amount that they can give. We have a kind of structured way of thinking, a way of analyzing data, and knowledge about what's worked in other countries, which is really valuable. I think I would really advise all of you, as much as possible, to actually talk to lots of people who are involved in, you know, in government or in the civil service or in non-profit organizations, because I think the advantage of that is, one, you have your own knowledge expertise. Two is it's often a way of actually getting access to kind of data sources that you wouldn't normally have access to. And, you know, by talking with other people around governments and these other organizations, you can actually often generate research projects and research ideas which you can then use for your own work and own research. So I think it's a mutually beneficial kind of relationship. I mean, I speak to a lot of people in the UK government in particular, and like Camille says, I mean, they're trying to make decisions on a basis of, relatively little knowledge. There's a very, very thin knowledge base. So actually finding out, we've taken an example of like heat pumps, very, controversial thing in Germany, desperately trying to increase them in the UK. What works? Is it through the price mechanism? What's elasticities? Is it about information? Is it about the skill supply of engineers, and where do we, where do we get them from? Is it about, can you use, social influencers and social multipliers to try and get more people to adopt that, and energy efficiency in homes in general? These are actually really important local questions, which are both important from a research point of view, but can also make a real difference on the ground. So I guess the very simple thing, get to talk to people.
Thanks. Esther?
I'd say, assuming that a lot of you are graduate students, even younger assistant professor, I would not worry too much yet. I think the most important about the policy impact. Otherwise, if it can get a bit depressing and the problem looks huge and whatever impact is small. So I think the best one can do is to find a problem that is of interest. The great advantage of this environmental economics is that it's such a big tent. So there are macro question and environment question and micro question. We can run experiments or something to please everyone. In that sense, it's common with development. That is also very large, big tent, intellectually exciting. And of course, the stakes are high, but that you shouldn't get saying that, oh, there's no point me doing my work if it doesn't have a policy impact. I think you will be too young to have a lot of policy impact. To start with, one just, does the work. Just pick a research project, something that interests you, spend some time getting it right, and then move to the next thing. In my experience, that's kind of how I try to conduct my life for a very long time as a graduate student, and then moving on. And then after many years of doing that, you turn back and you say, wow, like something has happened. A difference was made. I don't want to say I've made the difference, but the difference was made. So I think that's kind of the way to see it. It's a bit, don't worry too much. Super important topic. Whatever you do will find its niche at some point or another. Of course, it's always great to talk to people in the real world, wherever you can find them. NGO, policymaker, firms, etc., because they'll have interesting questions and research topic. But I wouldn't concern myself at this stage of what's the immediate use.
Sure. Yeah, no, I find myself agreeing with everything. I mean, especially with you, Camille.
Got bromance going on here, like an economist, isn't it?
No, but I think so. I wanted to emphasize that I think that these are big challenges. More to say that there's a lot of things to be done. I'm actually not pessimistic. I just I see big things coming up, and for all of you in the room, I mean, they are interesting intellectually too. So I think there's a lot of things to just think about in this area. And I certainly didn't want to say, oh, this is so scary because it's going to be so bad. I mean, but that's actually how this area somehow started, with somehow scare tactics. A lot of the climate debate in Sweden is carried out by people who don't know anything about the climate. They don't know about climate policy in the EU, which is like our climate policy also, because we're part of the EU. And there's just, in terms of policy, you don't have to say something smart, just knowing some basic things. You can, even if it's not your own research. I think my research, it's not comparable to yours, Esther, but I mean, it's mostly about like learning throughout life, learn more and more and more. And as long as you like it, keep doing it. And if you don't like what you're doing right now, you should maybe change a little bit direction, work on something you like, and that's going to carry you forward. So I very much agree with what you said. Eventually your work might have impact. But actually, along the way, you can help policymakers by just informing them of basics, which they don't know. And that's how I really completely agree with you.
Good. I think we're at time, but just two last things. I guess the first thing is that we talked about the number of PhD students at the LSE who are doing environmental stuff, and that's interesting. But obviously, as you can see from this panel, all the different people in different fields of economics, but it certainly doesn't stop there, because you know, if you go to firms now, you go to governments. I used to be a bit skeptical in some developing countries about whether there was real interest in this, and that's sort of changed in the last 5 years because the effects are being felt. So I guess what we've got now is a whole bunch of people who are interested in this issue, even bigger than there was in development. And what's good about that is that it means that whatever bit of economics you're in, you can come in and find interesting questions and problems. And often, you know, the value of talking to policymakers, NGOs, or whatever, is that they're trying to figure out something, or they have an idea, or they will help you collect data. And that kind of work has become more common, which is good, where they can supply data. But I think the key thing is that, you know, this is a fantastic area, both your own private returns in terms of going on to the job market, because there's a lot of demand for environmental economics. That's part of why the number of PhD students have gone up. But also it is an issue that across society and across the world, people feel really, really keenly. And that's important because it means that the demand for the knowledge you're creating is very, very high. And it's very incomplete, I think it's fair to say. And so, you know, as when me and Esther were in Cambridge, I think just before the COVID hit, you know, development economics portrayed as a movement. It now feels that this environmental economics is also a big movement, perhaps even going to be bigger than development economics. So you're all part of that, and we will now continue with our PhD talks after the break. Thank you.